Now, you also touched on this point. I think it's very important to discuss that, many countries now realize that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat, but pretty much every country is also incredibly economic dependent on China, whether you're talking about the United States, India, even Taiwan. China is Taiwan's biggest trading partner. What can be done to counter China when everyone is so reliant on it?
I think the answer lies in the question that you're asking, because you cannot see China cannot be defeated if at all, if it is a zero-sum game. If the Chinese know that we have nothing to lose, they're going to fight with you, right? So the only option that I see is to convert this reliance. You use the word reliance, right? That Taiwan is relying on China, India is relying on China, and the United States is relying on China to transform this war and bring in a sense of parity. That is to say that both countries in any given equation are mutually reliant on each other. That any move here is going to hurt the Chinese as well. Now, India proved that it could do it actually. So when you look at the ban on TikTok, right? Keeping aside the financial losses, if you actually saw the kind of emotional output that happened in India, because a lot of people were addicted to TikTok. And I'm telling this in a very positive sense because from some of the most remote areas in India, you had such good talent come out on TikTok, right? Guys who could never make it to the Bollywood or any of the cinema industry in India, they were showcasing their talents, and so there was a lot of pain and anguish when TikTok was banned. But Indian public showed that we are willing to take this pain in order to hurt the Chinese, right? Because an average Indian does not understand anything about data theft, doesn't understand anything about signals intelligence or cyber intelligence and so on. But the fact that it was projected as something meant to hurt China because 20 Indian soldiers were killed, Indians were willing to resist and say that we are willing to accept this pain. But what it cost to the Chinese was a huge market, right? There might be some people who say that this is just a small drop in the entire Chinese market, but it did matter to the Chinese. Right, so we need to find such areas, and that is why when the current Indian government also, when it speaks of self-sufficiency, Atmanirbharta, and all that, that is the whole motive to say that at some point we need to be able to turn around this trade disadvantage that we have with China in our favor. To say that we should also have enough and good number of things that we can either sell to China or we don't have to rely on China for such things. So. And that is what India is doing, and I think that's a lesson that most countries can draw from India. But it's not something that can be done immediately, because if funnily, if you look at the COVID times, right, when the second wave hit India, and that's when the maximum number of casualties were there in India. India refused to reach out to China for any equipment, in terms of dealing with COVID. Instead, they reached out to the European partners, which the Europeans actually gave us at whatever price they wished to. But where did the Europeans source it from? They sourced it from China. So instead of directly coming from China, it went all the way around and then came to India, right? So this is what happens. This is how Reliance has developed. But is there nothing that we can do? In the immediate sense, possibly not. But gradually you can, by moving the supply chains elsewhere. Like Apple, for example, it moved its manufacturing unit to India and so on. So it will be gradual, but it has to be a dedicated thing. It can't be a knee-jerk reaction now that we're angry with China for whatever has happened. But in a matter of few years, we're going to forget this and then move on. No, that's not going to happen. But even that is something that every country needs to take note of. For India, yes, we are clear. The whole point of Atmanirbharta is to say that we are equally wary of every country, because COVID has taught us the right lessons that we cannot rely on anybody. So to the extent that Western countries can come to India, help Indians produce stuff there, it's okay. But if it is going to be outsourced outside India, in a manner where if you're going to establish, if you're going to multiply the existing degrees of reliance, then that is not going to sit well with Indians. So yeah, but I think that's the only way forward. That is to build our own lines of production so that we can offset this kind of reliance we have on China.
It's kind of ironic because such a focus of international communism is the idea of breaking down nation states. And, ironically, what you're saying is required is for every nation who wants to counter China to become more self-sufficient.
Right. Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, even okay, that is because the rules of the games have changed. It's look at what happened again. Going back to the COVID time, right? What really happened? India is a country that went around giving vaccines free of cost to a whole bunch of nations, right? That is something that at that point in time it got some media attention, but today most people seem to have forgotten it again. But calling it vaccine maitri, that's vaccine friendship. India, even though its own people were suffering, we India, New Delhi realized that we had a responsibility for the world and it had to be fulfilled, right? At that point in time, you had the US hoarding vaccines. US did not, there's no kind of, so there is a certain way in which other countries think, right? So that really has taught India lessons, and it is a lesson that every country has to internalize now. That it is not, we are not looking inwards for the sake of hatred. It's not the Huntingtonian, clash of civilization, that every civilization we hate each other, so we have to look inwards for that reason. It is just to say that this pandemic has taught us some lessons, that free markets are important, globalization has its role, but at the same time, there is a certain degree of self-sufficiency that is required if we need to survive as nations, if we need to, especially countries like India, if we need to survive as civilizations. And that is why just yesterday I was listening to a former colonel of the Indian Army, who's done extensive research on cyber capabilities. This is what you're saying. If India, this whole civilizational narrative about India, if that has to survive, because for 5,000 years India has survived onslaughts of every kind, and that's how the civilization has stood. But if it has to survive another 1,000 years or hundreds of years, going forward from here, it is only possible if it develops self-sufficiency and self-reliance in the domain of cyber. Otherwise, China, the true strength of China, I mean, we are talking about the 1962 war and so on. If you look at all the wars, China does not have that martial ability to fight. Every war that they fought, they've had more number of casualties. They are incapable of fighting. Even the recent clashes that happened on the India-China border, the Chinese don't stand and fight for a very long time, right? So their way of fighting is different. What did they do? Immediately they turned off. I mean, it is speculated, but it is speculated that they turned off the electricity in Bombay, in Mumbai, right? So they have other ways of fighting. So if at all today, India, the entire cyber domain in India is dominated by products that are either Chinese or, for that matter, American, or from any European country, then you essentially have given the key to those countries. So your civilization is naturally going to collapse because you're completely going to be controlled by them. Your information, your narrative, your behavior in the cyber domain is completely going to be controlled by others. So this self-reliance, self-sufficiency that we're talking about is in certain key sectors, core sectors. But otherwise, I don't think that globalization is going to wind up, and people are not going to be. I mean, today I'm sitting here in the UK and I'm talking because there is going to be exchange of knowledge. University spaces are going to see students crisscross. People in my department as one of the highest number of students from Nigeria. So you see that it's not going to end, right? Exchange of knowledge, exchange of products, exchange of skills, and all of that will happen, but there will be a kind of reflection, because of all the problems we've suffered.
So it's interesting that you talk about how China is using these sort of other tools of warfare. It's kind of like we were talking about at the beginning. It's the warfare is a spectrum for them. How are they using their propaganda apparatus, their media, and I know we were talking about this earlier, but some of the racial affinities, like that's a big tactic the Chinese Communist Party uses.
So yeah, I mean, there are two aspects to the question you asked. One is about gathering human intelligence, and the other is the propaganda value that you were talking about, that is derived from it. So when you look at Chinese propaganda, the primary target is its domestic audience, because it is the Chinese people that need to be, the nationalistic fire has to be kept alive in them. So, for example, when you look at the whole narrative of century of humiliation, right? How is it that the narrative is actually being brought by the Chinese public so much so they're so loyal to this narrative? For this, I mean, since this is we are catering to an American audience here, there's something about the Eastern cultures that we need to really pay attention to. So, let me take you back to the year 1857. That the 1857 was the year when there was the Sepoy Mutiny, the first war of Indian independence that was happening in India, where where Indian soldiers had sort of revolted against the British East India Company. So there was one incident that happened at that point in time, which is quite interesting. Uh, it- Nobody can confirm if it is true or not, but there was one soldier who had revolted against the British, and he was hanged to death publicly, right? And so when he was being hanged to death, he apparently shouted out to the people who were watching, telling them that you all must ask my son to take revenge for this. All right. Now, after that incident, people forgot whatever happened. 30 years later, a British officer was shot by an Indian sepoy, an Indian soldier, and nobody could explain why the soldier shot the British officer. And in fact, even when he was produced before the court, the sepoy couldn't really bring himself to give a logical reason to say why he actually shot him. But then after this incident happened, suddenly there were pamphlets being circulated within the barracks that said that this guy who shot the officer was the only child of that man who was hanged, and the officer who he shot was the son of the officer who was responsible for the hanging of the guy in 1857. Right. Now, the reason I'm telling you this story, is that when you talk of revenge, right now, revenge is a theme that constantly flows in much of Eastern literature and Eastern cinema. Right. So the people really tend to buy this kind of narrative, especially when you couch it in terms of revenge and vengeance. That is what is I from my opinion, that is what is happening in China as well today. The more the Chinese are being, especially once there are firewalls to block information from outside, flowing into China, the Chinese are constantly being Chinese people are constantly being fed this narrative that the American political system is weak. The whole democratic political system is weak, and so we have grown. That's on the one side. But on the context of the century of humiliation, they are trying to stoke a certain kind of vengeance amongst the population. That is to say that we need to show that we are capable of growth. We need to show these Westerners that the answer for imperialism lies in China's growth. So that is one way they're trying to appeal. This was something similar to what happened at a very tactical and operational level in 1962 as well. So when you look at India's northeastern region, right, you find that the people there have racial similarities with Chinese. They don't look like the mainstream. I mean, it's wrong to call mainstream Indians because the northeasterners are just as mainstream as we are, but racially they look very different. They have the Mongoloid features. The Chinese kept on, tapping into those features and tapping into those similarities, and made sure that these tribes saw Indians as some sort of foreigners, aliens, and some sort of demonic people, who needed to be fended off. So we had multiple instances where information was flowing to the Chinese, and Indians were being killed. Soldiers, Indian soldiers were being lured and were being killed. Now, how did the Chinese manage to do it? One was, yes, the racial commonalities were there, but beyond it, they're being lured by offering things like salt, rice, and so on, and also telling that we are here to liberate you. Right? It's a kind of language. It's a kind of and in one instance, it's pretty odd. One of the stories that really struck me was that there was a .303 rifle, and the tribes had never seen a rifle in their life. So the Chinese showed this rifle to the tribes and said that this is a piece of wood. It's a valuable piece of wood that the Indians have dropped it here. We would like to return it to them. So can you give us details of where they are, what they're doing, and so on? So one, you're taking advantage of the ignorance of the tribes, but at the same time you're presenting yourself in this benign manner, so that the tribes then give you whatever information is possible. So today, when you look at what China is doing across the world through this whole narrative of century of humiliation and all that, and tapping into diaspora Chinese across the world, they're trying to impress upon them that they have to be active agents of the CCP, right? And what does this in turn lead to? This in turn leads to a massive stress on the Western counterintelligence capabilities. Because on the one hand, monitoring so many Chinese is going to be very difficult. On the other hand, you are making yourself completely, you're exposing yourself to accusations of racism and stuff, right? So, from a security and counterintelligence point of view, I think that even as the Western agencies as well as India conducts any kind of counterintelligence operations, we need to be focusing on the information domain. What can be said, what can be done to break this whole narrative that China has been building about, say, of the Middle Kingdom, or century of humiliation and so on. So if we can come up with answers to questions like this, alongside the other questions that you're asking about what the world can do in terms of reducing economic dependence and so on, then I think that we are thinking like the Chinese do, because the Chinese always want a 360-degree solution to things, and that is why they had something known as the three warfare, right? You had the legal, secular, information, and all that. So if confronted on all of these platforms, only then I think that you can have an overarching security architecture against China. So I think that is something that is missing now, and that's why I say that revisiting the 1962 war has a whole gamut of lessons for us, if at all we need to craft a strategy today.
Well, thank you very much for joining. This was a very interesting conversation. If anyone watching wants to learn more about you, where can they go?
I'm more into conducting research and writing long form papers. So so they can read my journal articles and stuff, or they can write to me on my email address, which you can share with them.